rolling pin for this. I've got my measuring tools. I've got my liquid measuring cups, my dry measuring cups. I've got small containers to hold my small mise en place, big bowls to hold large mise en place. I also have a dough cutter, which you don't necessarily need. You can use a spatula or even a knife, but this is nice because it doesn't have a blade on it and it's good for cutting dough. So, if you do not have a machine, actually, if you do have a machine, and I also have my sifter. If you do have a machine, you're going to use the dough hook attachment with your electric mixing bowl at a medium speed. And that's going to create the kneading, the friction that goes on with the movement of the dough, creating heat, allowing the gluten and the protein to grow, just like in the PowerPoint. All right? If you're not doing it by hand, you can just do it in a large bowl. Obviously, the largest bowl, large bowls create small messes. Small bowls create big messes. That's always my rule of thumb. So for this recipe, I need 2 cups of flour. And again, these are going to be level. So I can take my dough cutter and I can actually use that. Level them off. These are going to go right into my sifter. And I need an additional 2 tablespoons of flour. Whoops. I also need a teaspoon of salt. And again, I'm putting this right into my sifter. Most likely, because I use kosher salt, it's not going to go through. But if you use regular table salt, it will. And the salt adds flour. One thing that I did not mention in the PowerPoint is the addition of salt with yeast. If I was to put my yeast and water with the salt is going to kill it. So I want to dilute it in my dry ingredients. All right, so I've got my dry ingredients. I need 3/4 of a cup of warm water. All right, so 3/4 of a cup of warm water, and again, room temperature, body temperature, 98.6. Anything hotter will kill the yeast. Anything colder will stabilize it, and it won't allow it to grow. My dry ingredients go there. I also need a teaspoon of oil that's going to go into my dough. And I'm just going to put that in there. And that adds some body and some texture. And then I need a teaspoon of yeast. I've got 2 measuring spoons. One is dry. And that's going to sit on top. So this is the dry active yeast that you're probably going to use at home that you can find in the stores. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to stir that around. And I'll let that rest. I've also combined a yeast measurement that I would use for my sticky buns. And at the end of this whole demo, I'm going to show you the difference between the two. A pizza dough does not require a lot of yeast, and you're not going to see a lot of activity. It's probably just going to float to the top. It's not going to really expand. Whereas this one here, I have added a larger amount of yeast, but I've also fed it with sugar. I could feed this yeast with a little bit of flour and let that sit as well. But this one here, I actually use sugar, and we'll come back to this at the end, just so you can see what it's going to look like. It's actually going to mushroom all the way up to the top. So it's started as a 1/4 cup on, or 3/4 of a cup on both, but the difference is this one's not going to really grow, that one is. In here I have 2 cups and 2 tablespoons of flour. I've got a teaspoon of salt that I just sifted. All right, and after about 2 or 3 minutes, I'm just going to start adding my liquid. So I'm going to take my wooden spoon, I'm just going to make a well inside. Hopefully you can see it. Actually you can't. And I'm just going to add a little bit of water inside the well. This is the same process that I would do to make pasta, but I would use a fork. And all I'm trying to do is just absorb all that water. Once it's absorbed, I'm going to add some more, just so it's not flooded. I'm gonna cave in the sides, spin my bowl, and then start mixing. And then I'm gonna add the rest of my water and yeast. Now, I went a little short on the liquid because I want you to see a dry dough. All right, right now this is pretty flaky, but just by looking at it, I can tell it looks dry, but also by touching it, it feels kind of tough. So at this point, I'm gonna add a little bit more water. And again, I'm gonna use warm water, and I'm talking maybe a tablespoon or two at a time. Until I start to see the formation that I'm looking for. It's starting to collect, and I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive with my spoon. It's still kind of dry, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. And now it's starting to collect itself. So once I've got it collected into a ball, I'm going to clean off my spoon with my hands. And I'm just going to turn this out onto my work surface. My bowl, grab a little bit of flour, and now I'm just going to start kneading the dough, and all I'm doing is pressing with the palm of my hand and folding it over. Right now the dough is sticky, so dry dough we add more liquid. I can see it sticking to my hand. With a sticky dough, you just add a little more flour and add as much as you think you need, but don't overdo it or else you're going to be back to a dry state. Okay? And all I'm doing, and it's still pretty sticky, which I figured that. All I'm doing is just pressing and folding as we go along here. Press and fold, nice and smooth. And you can just tell by looking at it, really got to get aggressive. Tell just by looking at it, the gluten is developing and the proteins are forming. First part of the video, no sound. All right. So you can see it's getting a little bit softer. Just a few more minutes. How am I doing, Miss Riccadelli?
Good. Dough looks good.
And it's starting to come off my hands too, so I know that it's removing off, really forming. So from this point, I'm going to shape it because it's pretty smooth. If I press the dough, it should retract back, means that the yeast is active. There's a life going on inside that dough that needs to get out, and that's going to happen during the proofing process. So now I'm just going to shape this. It's just a baker's trick where you just kind of roll it into a nice tight ball until it's nice and smooth. This will allow it to proof evenly. And then that's going to go into a bowl, and a towel is going to go over that. And I'm just going to let that go for about 45 minutes. While that's working, I can make my sauce. Pizza sauce made with raw tomatoes. So just your basic crushed tomatoes. We need 3/4 of a cup of tomato. Pour those in without splattering. I forgot to wear my apron today. So you need 3/4 of a cup of tomato. And we need to season this up. So what are we going to season it up with? Well, we're going to use some salt, some pepper, and some Italian seasonings, which we're going to show you how to make. So for the salt, I'm going to put in about a half a teaspoon, because the cheese is salty also, so you don't want to over salt it. So I'm going with a half a teaspoon of salt. to go with about 1/4 teaspoon of black pepper. And this is the butcher block type, so it's very big. And then for my Italian seasonings, I'm going to take the 3, which we have basil leaves, and we're just going to combine it. So I need a teaspoon total. So I'm just going to kind of grab about 1/4 teaspoon of basil. And that's dry basil. I'm going to take 1/8 teaspoon of oregano. And I'll take about 1/8 teaspoon of thyme. So it gives me 1/2 teaspoon total of everything. Or a teaspoon total. Thyme you want to be really careful with. And then for this, you're just going to stir it up. And the flavors, oh, and garlic. I forgot garlic powder, but you can put garlic in if you like, it's optional. You can put onion powder in if you like, that's optional. So the faster you get these into your sauce, the more flavor your sauce is going to have. And then during the baking process of your dough, you'll maximize the flavors. All right. Now for assembly, I've got my pizza pan. Just want to clean off my work surface. And I'm going to line my pizza pan with cornmeal so that the pizza does not stick. And I'm going to put a friendly amount. So I'm going to use my fingertips, and I'm just going to sprinkle and let gravity take its course. I don't want an overpowering amount of cornmeal, but I want enough in there so it's not going to stick. Cornmeal has a higher smoking point than flour, so it'll effectively help your dough from not sticking while not burning. All right? So that's ready for that. And I went ahead and made some doughs earlier. Just to give you an idea, the scope and size of a pizza dough that has risen. So these were made about an hour ago. This is the one that I just made. So you can kind of see the difference in size. They're much, so all that CO2, carbon dioxide gas, the yeast is active. All right. This is the part where you would actually punch it down, which we'll do on our countertop. So the first thing I need is my bench flour. So there's a huge difference in letting it rise. I'm going to take my bench flour, and then I'm going to take my dough cutter, and I can use this to kind of detach the dough and then gently pick it up. What's the word? Satisfying? It's pretty satisfying. It's super light. So look at this air pocket right here. Pretty cool. So I'm going to punch that down. Use my fingertips. And I'm going to get this really coated with my flour. Stretch it out. And then you can do one of two things. You can stretch it by hand, which you would basically just stretch the ends using your knuckles, which are soft. Those of you with long fingernails, be careful. But this is the difference in a dough that's proofed for time and a dough that hasn't. The gluten has had a chance to relax, and it's much easier to stretch. All right. If you don't feel comfortable doing this, then make a circle. Make sure you have plenty of bench flour. Take your rolling pin, and then you want to roll from the center to the edges, turning. What we don't want to do is we don't want to get into this back and forth rolling action, because you're basically counterproductive. You're pulling from what you pushed, and you're pulling it back in the other direction. So it's not really stretching. It's just putting it back in the same spot. And again, from the middle to the sides, middle to the sides. And what I'm trying to do is trying to get it to the circumference of this pan. All right, I'm just going to stretch it out by hand. Lay it down. Not big enough. A little bit more. All right. Goes right to the edge. And then for my crust, I just take my fingers And I'm just going to go around the edges. And I'm working, this one's even retracting a little bit. All I'm doing is just making a little ridge all the way around the dough. I'm spinning my pan rather than reaching. I just spin the pan so that it's in a manageable area for me to work. All right. I'm going to take my sauce, drop that right in the center, and we're going to spread this from the center to the edges. Again, I'm spinning my pan so that I can work evenly. And if you think you want more sauce, then you can add more sauce. It's up to you. This is where you have to decide if you're going to put pepperoni on at home, or sausage, or mushrooms, or onions. This is where you have to decide, are you going to do it before you put the cheese on or after? And that's all your own personal preference. All right? And don't be afraid, you can stretch this out. Don't be afraid to stretch it out while it's on the tray. We need a little bit of Parmesan, so I'm going to just drop this Parmesan on my fingertips, in my hand, and use my fingertips to spread it. Just add some flavor. You want to use a really good Parmesan if you can get it. If not, store-bought's fine. And then the last thing is your mozzarella. And this is just your basic shredded mozzarella. And again, I like to have this in the bowl. It's easier to work with out of the bowl. Then I can just use my hands and then just kind of shimmy it all around. Again, I'm working the tray and moving the tray rather than trying to reach and stretch. So the key to this is making sure that it's even. And every question I get every year that I make pizza in class, can we do stuffed cheese crust? You can do whatever you want. You're at home, it's your pizza, your choice. Okay? Now, I doubled this recipe. So there's a pizza that I made. I've got another dough. I've got 3 doughs that I'm able to work with today. And at my house, I would make 4 pizzas and we'd have leftovers the next day. So it's something that when you make for dinner, if you double the recipe, you can get a ton of dough out of it. Last thing, like I said, I wanted to revisit the yeast. So this is the yeast that I would use for my sticky buns. And you can see how it's just ballooned up. So it started out at a 3/4 of a cup, and it's grown. It's fed with the sugar. I'm trying to get on the camera. It fed with the sugar, and it's over time and temperature, it's allowed it to grow. So this is something you would not use for a pizza dough. You would use for something soft like a biscuit, a cinnamon bun, or some sort of pastry. You would need more yeast to lighten things up. For pizza dough, you want it to be crusty and crisp, so you wouldn't use as much yeast. All right?